In 1853, in Tennessee, a wealthy family began to experience a slow and mysterious death. Their clothes, beautifully sewn, were hiding something much darker. At the center of this was Louisa, an enslaved woman who worked behind the scenes. No one noticed her actions, but they were about to change everything. On a humid day in midsummer, the warm Tennessee air clung to the cotton dresses drying outside the grand plantation house. Inside, the family moved through their usual routine. The mistress sipped tea quietly, while the master glanced around with little attention. But shadows, unseen and unnamed, gathered around them. In a back room, the enslaved women, including Louisa, worked at sewing. Louisa was graceful as she sewed, her fingers moving with precision. She didn't show emotion, but her eyes held a deep memory of sorrow and a quiet resolve. Her work was intimate, repairing the family's clothing, from gowns to christening dresses. Each garment passed through her hands, and each stitch held more than just craftsmanship. It carried a quiet plan. At first, the symptoms were subtle. The mistress had a small rash, dismissed as a bug bite. The children complained of feeling cold and having aches, but the doctor just chalked it up to a summer fever. Louisa's hands kept working in silence, and no one suspected her. Days passed, and then the first death came. The youngest daughter, found still in her bed. The family was struck with silence. Not even the sound of mourning filled the air. Then, the matriarch grew weak, her skin blistered and her breath slowing. The doctor started to question his earlier diagnosis of fever and suspected poisoning. He ordered the clothes to be examined, noticing strange marks and discolorations, but he couldn't find any clear answers. There was no lab to confirm his suspicions, just his growing unease. As the family's condition worsened, whispers began. Could the poison be hidden in the clothes Louisa made? Her presence was overlooked. She was quiet, obedient, efficient. No one had seen her preparing anything unusual, but rumors spread. The garments she worked on were linked to each death, and soon people began to suspect the worst. Was Louisa using plants with toxic properties, woven into the clothing over time? Despite the rumors, Louisa remained silent. Her name wasn't recorded in any books, and she never spoke up. Yet her work, every stitch, every patch, tied her closer to the growing fear within the household. As the family members died one by one, the house became a place of fear and illness. The servants moved quietly, and the once lively halls of the White family were now filled with only footsteps and faint coughs. Behind closed doors, the family members wore the clothes Louisa had made, and strange marks began to appear on their skin. The story of Louisa didn't truly begin with the deaths, but much earlier, in her past, a past full of pain and mystery. Born into slavery in North Carolina, Louisa was sold to another owner in Tennessee when she was just 14 years old. This move followed an incident, vaguely recorded in her old master's ledger. There were rumors, never proven, that a boy who had wronged her met a sudden violent end in the fields before he could scream. When Louisa arrived at the new plantation, she was quiet and composed. Her skill with cloth was immediately recognized, and it was this talent that spared her from the grueling work in the fields. Instead, she was moved to the seamstress quarters and put under the supervision of the house mistress. But what no one knew, or cared to know, was that Louisa carried more than just a needle. In her first years on the plantation, Louisa grew close to Bet, an older woman and a midwife who had cataracts clouding her eyes, but a sharp memory for plants that could bring death. Bet shared the old ways with Louisa, how certain roots and saps could slowly kill when used just right. Bet had seen her own children sold off, and though her hands trembled with age, she passed these dark teachings to Louisa. Louisa quietly began to gather herbs, geyserweed, belladonna berries, wild hemlock, under the guise of collecting materials for dyes and washing. No one suspected her. The White family never questioned her comings and goings, but Louisa knew exactly how to use these plants. Alone, they were deadly, but combined in the right amounts and sewn into the fabric of the family's clothes, they became silent killers. Death would come not with a scream, but slowly through the skin. While the family was unaware, Louisa stitched each garment carefully. She worked slowly, knowing time was on her side. Death didn't need to come suddenly. It was better that it didn't. By midsummer, an unusual pattern began to emerge. Servants who came into contact with the family's clothing began to fall ill. A maid collapsed after wearing a hand-me-down shawl. A stable boy developed painful ulcers after handling freshly washed coats. The plantation doctor started to suspect something in the environment, maybe mold or bad water, but the symptoms didn't add up. They were unpredictable. Some showed quickly, others took longer. The White family dismissed his concerns, calling them mere superstition. But among the enslaved workers, rumors spread differently. They spoke of Louisa's hands being either blessed or cursed. Some feared her, others left offerings at her door, roots, thread, beads. They didn't speak openly, but they knew or suspected something about her. As the family's condition worsened, the signs were impossible to ignore. Their youngest son, once strong, began to lose weight. The master of the house started seeing things, yelling at shadows and accusing his own children of betrayal. His wife lay in bed, her breath shallow and ragged, her eyes glazed over. Rumors of witchcraft spread beyond the plantation, and a traveling preacher was called in. He found nothing but sorrow and decay. Louisa, however, remained calm, her fingers always moving as she sewed. One night, the cook claimed to see Louisa speaking to a shadow by the trees, perhaps the ghost of Bet. When questioned, Louisa lowered her eyes and continued her work in silence. Her quiet was unbroken. The plantation, once full of life, now felt suffocating, filled with the heavy scent of decay. Louisa stitched on, each stitch an act of defiance, each hemline a barrier between vengeance and invisibility. By late August, the plantation house was no longer filled with music or chatter. It was silent, with the suffocating air of a home in decline. The family's downfall had stopped being a mystery. It was now a certainty. One by one, the family members succumbed to an illness no doctor could identify, no prayer could stop, and no servant could ignore. The master, once so commanding, now wandered the halls confused, his skin yellowed and his eyes bloodshot. He muttered names, some living, some long dead, and flinched from his clothes, which seemed to burn against his skin. In a fit of spasms, he ripped off his shirt mid-meal in front of shocked guests. They left immediately. The mistress, bedridden for weeks, no longer recognized anything around her. Her skin was covered in painful sores that leaked pus and blood when she moved. The new doctor, brought in by the overseer, suspected arsenic poisoning, but he couldn't explain why it was affecting the skin. He recommended removing all fabric from the sleeping quarters and starting fumigation. Despite the doctor's efforts, nothing changed. The remaining children stayed in their rooms, struggling with pain and weakness. Their joints ached, their gums bled. The eldest son, once expected to inherit the estate, refused to leave his bed. When he did rise, his words were jumbled, speaking of insects under his skin and fire behind his eyes. He clawed at his neck until it bled, and when a nursemaid tried to calm him, he struck her across the face. She left that night, never to return. The staff began to act differently. They avoided looking at the family, communicating only in silent glances. Some servants began to refuse to handle the family's clothes. The laundry room, usually full of activity, now stood mostly empty. A few workers were punished for leaving their posts, but others fell ill, their hands covered with strange sores that wouldn't heal. Those who touched the clothes too often seemed to become sick and never fully recovered. Louisa, however, remained unaffected. She showed no signs of illness, her skin remained clear, and she continued to sew calmly in her corner. She responded to orders, nodded when spoken to, and delivered finished garments with steady precision. Yet her silence seemed heavier now, as if it carried more meaning than before. One evening, a housemaid named Sarah confided in another that Louisa had asked her for a particular plant from the woods, a root with a bitter smell, something not used in dyes. Sarah had brought it to her months ago, thinking nothing of it at the time, but now Sarah wondered if it was connected to the strange events happening on the plantation. Was Louisa using something unnatural? Soon after, the overseer's daughter was found unconscious in the parlor, her skin flushed and her breathing ragged. She had been wearing a shawl recently repaired by Louisa. The overseer, furious and desperate, tore apart Louisa's quarters in search of answers, but he found nothing, only thread, needles, and folded fabric. Louisa stood quietly, her arms at her sides, her face unreadable. The next morning, the overseer demanded that Louisa be confined, but the master, too weak to act, refused. "She's done nothing," he mumbled, his eyes glazed over. The house was falling apart, and its master was too far gone to intervene. That night, a fire broke out in a far shed. Though it was quickly contained, the fear it caused spread rapidly. Some believed the land was cursed, while others whispered of spirits, voodoo, and a silent rebellion carried out not with knives or fire, but with thread and cloth. And Louisa continued to sew, her hands calm, her gaze steady. No one dared stop her. The plantation had become a place of absences. The windows once open to let in the breeze were now shut tight against imagined threats. The halls, once full of life, were now quiet, with only the occasional shuffle of footsteps and the soft, persistent coughs of those wasting away behind closed doors. The arrival of Dr. Albert Graves, a physician from Charleston, brought new tension to the house. He had a reputation for treating illnesses that others feared, and as he moved through the estate, he felt an unease he couldn't explain. His examination began methodically, collecting samples and documenting symptoms, but it was the clothing that caught his attention. Every garment worn by the sick showed signs of discoloration in the linings and stiff stitching, as if something oily had been worked into the fabric. A faint, bitter odor lingered on the clothes, sharp and unfamiliar. Dr. Graves isolated the garments and advised that no one wear clothing made by Louisa until further notice. He spoke with the overseer and the house staff, asking quiet questions about Louisa. Had anyone seen her mixing anything into her work? No one gave a direct answer. The staff's silence spoke volumes. Tension grew as whispers turned to accusations. The overseer, still angry over his daughter's collapse, demanded that Louisa be brought forward. She stood in the center of the parlor, surrounded by the sickened members of the household. They asked her questions. Had she handled strange substances? Had she poisoned the fabrics? Who had taught her what she knew? Louisa answered calmly, "None of it." She looked past them, beyond their fear and sickness, her gaze unwavering. The master, too weak to rise from his bed, sent word that no action should be taken without proof. But proof, it seemed, was something no one could find. Dr. Graves took a sample of the fabric and attempted some chemical tests, but the results were inconclusive. He suspected a toxin, possibly from native plants, but couldn't identify the exact compound. Yet fear doesn't wait for certainty. The staff demanded Louisa's punishment. Some called for whipping, while others whispered of darker things. The plantation, no longer governed by law, was instead ruled by fear. The so-called trial held for Louisa was not truly a trial at all. There were no judges, just the overseer, the physician, and a gathering of the weakened, fearful people. Louisa was locked in a storage room beneath the house, a dark place where cloth was stored in bales and rats moved unseen. She did not speak, she did not cry, she remained completely still. When the cook slipped food through the door, she noticed Louisa whispering, not prayers but names, names no one recognized, or perhaps names they did recognize but refused to acknowledge. Then a storm hit, a violent night, filled with howling winds and flashing lightning. A bolt struck a tree near the house, and in the chaos that followed, the storage room door was found open. Louisa was gone. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, and no trace of her escape. The door had not been broken, and some claimed it had never even been locked. The overseer launched a manhunt, bringing in dogs and contacting marshals, but Louisa had vanished without a trace, leaving only fabric scraps and an unfinished garment behind. The garment, half-stitched and bearing the master's monogram, had a needle still embedded in the hem. The family continued to weaken. One by one they fell silent, each person fading away, never returning to health. The plantation was left in disrepair, abandoned by winter. Some claimed Louisa drowned in a creek nearby, while others believed she escaped north, helped by those who understood what she had done. Among the enslaved people who remained in the region, another story was told, of a woman who sowed death not from hatred, but from memory, a woman who vanished into legend, not into the woods, but into something much greater. More than a century later, the plantation lies in ruin. The house is half swallowed by ivy, its roof collapsed, and its walls blackened by time and storms. Few tourists venture into these woods anymore. Those who do often turn back when they reach the overgrown road, where the trees seem unnaturally close, their branches twisted like reaching fingers. But every few years, someone makes their way to the ruins, amateur historians, ghost hunters, or travelers drawn by a feeling they can't explain. They come for the story of Louisa, though few know her name. In most retellings, she is known simply as the seamstress or the silent one. Some say she was a witch, cursing the family with dark rituals. Others believe she was a martyr, an avenger, someone who turned the tools of submission into weapons. The truth, if it ever existed, has long unraveled, yet strange things remain. In 1962, a man named Calvin Murdoch bought the land to clear timber. While working on the main house, he discovered a small trunk hidden beneath the floorboards of the sewing room. Inside were scraps of fabric, each carefully folded and labeled with names. Names that matched those in the family's burial records. Some of the scraps were stained with dark, oily smudges. One piece caused a rash on a worker's skin that lasted for weeks. Murdoch abandoned the project within the month. In 1985, two anthropology students from Nashville visited the site. One of them, Annalise Turner, wrote in her field journal that the ruins felt too quiet, as though the house was waiting for something. She described finding sewing needles embedded in the floor, rusted but still sharp. That night, she dreamed of a woman sitting in the shadows, her eyes gleaming above a broken sewing table. Annalise never returned. The local archives hold little information. The plantation's records were lost in the war, leaving only scattered documents behind. A doctor's journal with entries that abruptly end in 1853, a death ledger with more names than graves, and a single letter from the house mistress, written in trembling ink, ending with the words, "She watches while we sleep." I know it now. Among the nearby black communities, oral traditions endure. Elder women speak of a spirit that punishes cruelty slowly, patiently. They call her by no name, but leave spools of thread on their windowsills just in case. No one remembers who started this custom, but it's understood that it's not wise to forget. A local preacher once attempted to exorcise the grounds. He lasted only 3 days before fleeing in the night. When asked what he saw, he would only say, "Some wounds never close. Some hands never stop sewing. Some still doubt Louisa's existence, believing her to be a fiction born from guilt and fear, but they cannot explain the garments. On rare occasions, fragments of 19th century fabric show up at estate sales or antique stores. Beautifully stitched, aged but intact. Several collectors report feeling uneasy when handling these items. One claimed his fingertips went numb, another fell ill after bringing a bonnet home. No scientific explanation has ever provided clarity. And so, the legend persists. The plantation remains untouched, not out of respect, but out of fear. Trees have overtaken the paths, the foundation has begun to buckle, and no birds nest in the rafters. But in the sewing room, faintly visible beneath layers of dust, is a message scratched into the stone. Louis. Was it meant to be her name? A warning? A confession? No one knows. But when the wind blows through the house, it sounds like thread slipping through fabric.